Yeah, well, I will go ahead and kick us off then. Good afternoon and welcome to the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center seminar series. So our goal with these monthly and general virtual gatherings is to highlight research that supports climate adaptation across the Southeast. My name is Carrie Furness. I'm not your usual host, you may notice. And I'm the assistant consortium director here at North Carolina State University, and just glad to be here with you. So I want to go ahead and start with a few meeting logistics, and then we'll request your feedback via a short poll, and then introduce our speaker, Laura DeCunto. And I did pronounce that right, Laura? Yes. All right, here we go. So yeah, so some of the features of this Zoom webinar technology, recognize y'all may be very familiar, but we all do use different platforms, is you can see on the screen here, we are recording it and we will post it both to our website and actually distribute it also afterwards. The chat box in this webinar framework is disabled, but you can ask questions in the Q&A box. Then when we will address those at the end of the presentation. And then I also have the option for you to potentially raise your hand to ask your question out loud and interact with our speaker directly. So you can enable closed captions, you can see there too. We also have a nifty new Zoom feature where you can actually translate those captions once enabled into other languages. So hope you can use that if needed. So we will go ahead and launch a poll real briefly to just give you a few seconds to fill that out. This helps us know who's on the line today, how you found out about us, and maybe help us know how to get it word out better. Looks like a fair number of federal agencies, representatives, state agencies, and you all are reading the Southeast Cast newsletter. Thank you for that. Glad to see that. So yeah, just another couple seconds to fill that out if you will enter your information there. Yeah, and we'll go from there. Okay. So we'll go ahead and end that and maybe share the results real briefly and then, yeah. All right, great. Well, thanks. And now I am going to stop my sharing and move on to introducing our speaker. So Laura, if you would like to go ahead and start your share while I introduce you, that would be great. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, who is a scientist who's worked with us here at the Southeast CASC for several years. Laura is a quantitative ecologist at the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Gainesville, Florida. They develop decision support tools, including models and visualizations that assist natural resource managers in understanding the potential ecological impacts of an uncertain future. Laura's current work focuses on developing tools, visualizations, and ecological models for coastal wetland ecosystems, such as the Everglades and the Louisiana coast. So now go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. My project is titled Integrating Sea Level Rise Scenarios into Everglades Restoration Planning. And so what I first wanted to do is start off with a little bit about the Everglades in case you're unfamiliar with it. So the Everglades is about a 47,000 kilometer squared subtropical wetland system, and it's situated in central and southern Florida. And it starts from near Orlando, and it stretches all the way down to the coast of Florida. So this landscape is characterized by some extremely slow-moving sheet flow. So this is water that's moving so slow that plant growth is still able to propagate. And so the Everglades is largely a flat ecosystem, but small changes in elevation of about 5 to 10 centimeters can create some small topography and generate what we call the ridge and slough landscape. So there's ridges that hold sawgrass prairies, and then the sloughs contain pockets of open water and long hydroperiod plants like water lily. This system is highly dynamic. It experiences a wet and dry season, and so rainfall largely determines the water levels across the system. And this landscape supports a huge diversity of wildlife, from birds and alligators, snakes and panthers, snails, crayfish, fish, and other reptiles. Each of these animals is adapted to this highly dynamic nature, and they need a specific profile of amount and timing of water on the landscape to be successful. So the Everglades when I first started in the Everglades, I was surprised to find out that the Everglades is intensely managed. And so from the 1800s to the 1960s, there was extensive efforts to drain the Everglades, building canals and levees, and this resulted in about half of the original extent of the Everglades being lost. And then 70% of the water flow that used to move through the landscape has been lost as well. So because of that, the ecosystem began to rapidly degrade. For example, super colonies of hundreds of thousands of wading birds would nest and raise young in the Everglades historically almost every year. But those birds started to wane or disappear entirely due to the restricted water flow and lack of prey availability. So in 2000, Congress authorized what we call the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP. And CERP requires the construction of water control structures to restore as much of the flow back to the pre-drainage system as possible, while still maintaining water supply and flood control for Floridians. So on this slide on the left here is an image that shows the general pattern of water flow in the Everglades before those drainage attempts began in the 1800s. And then this middle figure shows the current flow regime of the Everglades, where much of the water flows to the east and west of Lake Okeechobee, and not a lot is making it down to the southern part of the Everglades. And then this final image on the right here is what we hope the restored flows will look like when Everglades restoration is complete. So to further illustrate how managed the Everglades is, this is a figure that's commonly used by resource managers of the Everglades to understand water inflows and outflows within the system. And so what you're seeing here is a bunch of pumps and other water structures that can be opened or closed to generate desired water levels in their respective compartments. And these decisions can be made daily to weekly, depending on the current weather events and resource needs across the system. So our partner in this project is known as RECOVER, which stands for Restoration, Coordination, and Verification. And so this is an interdisciplinary interagency group, and we have federal, state, and tribal institutions that work together to ensure the system-wide success of CERP. The Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District are 50-50 partners in leading the implementation of CERP. And then the rest of these agencies offer expertise to RECOVER to provide recommendations to managers and decision makers for more success of the system instead of on a project-specific focus. And so RECOVER also collaborates closely with scientists from academia and nonprofits who do basic research in the Everglades to ensure that the most up-to-date science is considered when they make these recommendations. So RECOVER actually has a unique role in CERP as they're responsible for ensuring the adaptive management is implemented in Everglades restoration. And so usually when they're assessing a project or working with a project in CERP, RECOVER will first go through a process they call evaluation. And this, sometimes they call this model land. So this is where hydrodynamic models and ecological models are run under different restoration plan scenarios to give members an idea of the potential system-wide outcomes of a restoration project. After a project is implemented, the assessment phase happens. So the assessment is monitoring land, where on-the-ground conditions are observed and compared back to that evaluation phase or the model results. And then both of those exercises are integrated and communicated to decision makers and planners so that the next project can be more successful. And then in addition to that, the planning and integration and the results from the assessment can be fed back into the evaluation or modeling phase so that we can adjust our models and adjust our monitoring to ensure that the right information is being collected and that we can improve things even further. And so this is our cycle of adaptive management that Recover goes through when they're assessing and evaluating different CERP projects. And so I work with the USGS Joint Ecosystem Modeling Team, or GEM, and we partner closely with Recover all the time. And what we do is we co-develop models and tools with Recover and other restoration partners to support their evaluation processes and support restoration decision-making. And so we host a suite of models on our website, gem.gov, for restoration planners to use. And these are reflective of ecological indicators of Everglades ecosystem health and species of interest like the endangered Cape Sable seaside sparrow. And then we also use vegetation modeling as well. So in a typical evaluation process or model land process, hydrologists working with Recover will generate hydrologic scenarios of alternative restoration plans for a project. These hydrologic scenarios are used as inputs into our GEM ecological models, and these provide spatially and temporally explicit outputs. And then those outputs are usually post-processed by us into visualizations, charts, and tables so that Recover can synthesize these into their recommendations for a project. And so these figures often make it into Recover's system status reports, reports to Congress, and NEPA permitting documentation. So we're always working with Recover to figure out the best ways for us to make visualizations and deliver information that is most useful to them. So both those in Recover, but also independent scientific entities, have recognized that a missing piece in this process has been to explore the impact of sea level rise in the evaluation process. So before the Biscayne Bay Southeastern Everglades Ecosystem Restoration Project, which is also known as BBCER, sea level rise was not really incorporated into models used for evaluation, and BBCER is actually still going through its evaluation phase right now. So GEM and Recover have worked together for a long time, as I said, to provide visualizations and information from the ecological models that allows them to evaluate restoration projects efficiently. But incorporating sea level rise scenarios probably is going to require additional visualizations or changes to those visualizations to better be able to tease out sea level rise impacts from restoration impacts. And so the challenge here is, what information do we need to tease out the impacts of sea level rise from restoration scenarios, and how should that information be delivered so that it's most useful? So that brings us to our project objectives, where we wanted to work with Recover to identify their information needs when incorporating sea level rise scenarios into the evaluation process. And then once we understood those needs, we wanted to co-develop the model post-processing visualizations and tables that allow Recover and other restoration partners to tease apart these changes due to restoration or sea level rise, or sometimes both. And so this project developed in an iterative, co-productive way where we checked in with Recover several times throughout the process to collect both informal and formal feedback and refine what we were doing after each encounter. So in January of 2023, we kicked off the project with focus groups, or small groups of Recover members to ask about their initial thoughts. Then from those initial thoughts, we actually developed prototype tools. And those tools were based off of what we heard in the discussion from those focus groups. In summer 2023, we teamed up with some social scientists at the University of Florida to conduct individual interviews with Recover members to dig deeper into their information needs and perceived barriers, in addition to getting feedback on these prototype tools that were developed. After we analyzed the interviews, we were able to further refine those prototype tools that we developed. And then in May 2024, we presented our summary of the interviews to Recover, and then presented those refined tools for another round of feedback from Recover. After that, we finalized those tools based on this additional set of feedback. So for the talk, I'm going to go through talking about each of these instances and what we found and how that fed into the next phase of the project. And this is going to be a little bit different than a typical sort of methods and results fashion. But just to show like how we took information and we adjusted as we went through in this iterative process. So for focus groups, Dr. Maisha Clark and Stephanie Castellano at the University of Florida were our social scientist partners for the focus groups and the interviews that we conducted. Our focus groups occurred as a hybrid activity with small in-person groups and a couple online breakout groups for a total of 6 focus groups. And the focus groups discussed 2 broad questions. So the first question was whether individuals could identify the types of evaluations or decisions that would need to consider sea level rise. And the second question focused on what kinds of ecological model outputs or information would be the most useful to understanding how sea level rise was impacting those potential restoration outcomes. So each group took notes on large pieces of paper, and some group discussions were recorded to ensure that nothing was missing in that conversation. So for the first question of what types of evaluations or decisions will need to consider sea level rise, most of the groups settled on all of them. And this is mainly because Recover takes a system-wide perspective. And so if sea level rise is impacting one part of the system, it will need to be considered even if the current project they're focused on is not coastal one. And then for the kinds of ecological model outputs that the focus groups identified were projecting vegetation succession as sea level rise increases. So how fast can the mangroves move upland as sea level rise continues, and whether deliveries of fresh water are going to prevent the vegetation from completely going away and we're having an open water system there. So we also heard that viewing output at different temporal or spatial scales was important. And also what was important was providing interactive data visualizations like through a website. So from there, we created 3 prototype tools that Recover members could react to during the interviews. So the first one was an animated map that showed model output through time. And so some of the model outputs are habitat suitability, some are population models, but all of them are spatially explicit and temporally explicit to some degree. And so that's so the animated maps would show the output through those different timestamps. The second were static maps, and we showed them at 5-year intervals with bar charts that showed hectares of each output category. And this was so that users could see the landscape patterns, but they were also able to have sort of a quantitative signal on the map on the model output as well. And then the final was interactive maps. And so these were in a GIS system where you could toggle on and off different layers of the inputs and the outputs from the models. So once we completed these prototype tools, our collaborators at the University of Florida actually reached out to all the Recover members and managed to interview 39 of them to get a deeper understanding of their needs and reactions to the prototype tools. The interviews also asked about how individuals thought sea level rise would impact the Everglades restoration outcomes. It also asked about challenges and opportunities for integrating sea level rise into this evaluation process, what their perception of the current GEM modeling tools were, and of course the reactions to the prototype tools that I just described. These interviews were recorded, and a qualitative data analysis process using in vivo software was used to pull out common deductive and inductive themes from these interviews. So now I'm going to go through some of the major themes from the interviews. So when discussing barriers to integrating sea level rise into evaluations, a lot of individuals said sea level rise projections are not commonly integrated into the hydrologic models due to a lack of data and resources. And they also mentioned that there is great uncertainty. So many of these models use historical data to infer the future, but we know conditions will be changing and they may fall outside of that historical variability. And this is true of both the hydrologic and ecological models. So the hydrologic models use historic climate data to inform the hydrology simulations, and the ecological models are built from Everglades monitoring data. And so despite having a robust monitoring network, the highly dynamic system already generates uncertainty in model predictions. And this uncertainty is greater when the model is asked to predict outside the range of the conditions that it was trained on. And so one quote from an interviewee said, "We can't answer with any certainty yet whether we're going to have more water in the long run or less, and that's a big problem." When we asked Recover members about the limitations of the modeling tools, respondents talked about a lack of succession modeling that incorporates sea level rise. And so lack of succession mainly refers again to the hydrologic models. So when generating simulations incorporating sea level rise, currently the simulations are run with sea level rise increased all at once instead of incrementally over the simulation period. And of course, this doesn't reflect reality and could obfuscate the ability of the ecological models to more accurately reflect potential outcomes from the sea level rise. And so similarly, interviewees wanted to see modeling where feedbacks between the hydrologic and ecological models were implemented so that we could see vegetation succession that impacts soil accretion, which impacts elevation, and eventually the hydrodynamics on the system. And so that they also mentioned temporal and spatial limitations that arise from using regional climate models. And so, for example, the hydrologic and ecological models are generally run at a 400-meter resolution, but the regional climate models operate on about a 100-kilometer grid. So downscaling options exist, but this can introduce a lot of uncertainty into both models that Recover members view as limitations to using these sources. And so thinking back about the succession, one interviewee said, okay, if you have subsidence or accretion, how is that then feeding into an elevation model for next year and the year after that? And how does that impact the vegetation community? So people are really thinking about this in a very system-wide perspective and noticing the linkages between all of these processes. And they want that reflected in the models and the model output. So when we asked about their ecological modeling needs, respondents definitely wanted more models focused on a system-wide perspective than species-specific models. And they also wanted models that helped them understand relative resilience and vulnerability to the indicators of sea level rise. They wanted to identify thresholds or tipping points for ecological indicators of Everglades health. And one thing to point out is that GEM has been working on a model to try to meet this kind of need, which is called the Everglades vulnerability analysis. But this does take time to develop, so it hasn't delivered everything that they need quite yet. And finally, they wanted to be able to easily assess trade-offs with these models. So trade-offs between different indicators of ecosystem health. If you prioritize or if you make conditions better for one indicator, it could make conditions worse for another. And so they want to be able to look at that when they're making decisions. And so one interviewee said, we're not going to be able to protect everything. So what layers can we use to identify those areas that are already most resilient and focus on those first? So when we asked what Recover might need in order to adopt a new GEM tool or way of delivering information, many requested a workshop where they could explore the tools in a group setting. They also requested easy access to tool developers to answer questions and get help. And some also identified the need for clear user guides. So we already have some of this available on the GEM website, but clearly we can improve our communication on this, on where to find these resources. And it could be a reminder to us that maybe something like a yearly overview of GEM models and tools to recover could be useful, especially if there's turnover at the Recover group and new members might not be as familiar with how we help Recover make their decisions and evaluations. And also, GEM is continually updating our models and tools, and so it might be good to summarize for everyone what we have done in the last year. So now I'm going to go over some reactions to the prototype tools. So for the first one, the animated maps, they seemed useful to understand landscape level change, so like encroachment of mangroves. They also indicated that these kinds of tools were great for communication to a non-scientific audience. The animations make it very interesting to look at. However, they did note that this would not be useful for scientific evaluations, and these are the evaluations that Recover does, because of the lack of access to quantitative data in this type of tool. So the maps and charts options were thought to be a better for a scientific audience. And respondents said it was easier to make comparisons between time steps and scenarios with a visualization like this. And they thought that the maps and charts would help them quantify changes. However, some people pointed out that they would want more control over the temporal increments that are being shown here. And then finally, the interactive maps. Recover members responded very positively to the interactive maps, thought they would be useful to exploring trade-offs between indicators. But some individuals were worried that a lack of GIS skills would prevent them from using the tool to its full potential. So overall, the most preferred of the prototype tools was actually the Maps with Charts option. And this may seem surprising at first, but this is also the most similar visualization and information delivery system to what they already receive from GEM right now, with some slight changes to accommodate for the fact that they will want to see differences from sea level rise and restoration teased out. So given that that was the most popular prototype tool, we went with that as our finalized tool to present to them in a feedback workshop. So at our feedback workshop, we produced visualizations that reflected the maps and charts prototype tool using some real data this time to show Recover at an in-person meeting. And so what we did was we set up stations around the room where Recover members could provide what they liked and disliked about different aspects of the visualizations. And we set them up in stations named interpretation, aesthetics, layout, and measurements, just to try to key in on different parts of the visualizations that they liked and disliked. And so small groups of people had about 5 minutes to discuss their thoughts about each subject, and then put their feedback on the sticky notes under the different subjects. So we really wanted them to point out what they liked and what they disliked, so that we didn't get rid of anything that they liked, and that we were better able to assess what needed to be changed. And so this feedback was summarized, and we were able to identify ways to improve the new visualizations further, especially to make sure we didn't get rid of anything anyone really liked. And so once we did that, we delivered the final R scripts on those visualizations and into a data release, a USGS data release. So for evaluation processes, the static maps and charts were sufficient for reporting, but there still is a big interest in making an interactive tool that accompanied static maps and charts, so that individuals in Recover could extract information that was maybe more agency specific than the needs related directly to the goal of Recover. And so we originally did plan to develop an interactive tool using ArcGIS Online, but there were some financial issues where we couldn't do that within the project's budget when we originally thought we could. But interest has only grown for a tool like this, so our team at GEM has received funding from another source to provide this interactive tool and probably make it more extensive than what we originally were planning to do. And so we're using insights from these interviews to build an R-Shiny application that is interactive and lets users change scenarios to see real-time changes in the model prediction. So there is a person on the GEM team, Vincent Spade, who's really been taking this to fruition and has built a prototype demo already. And this is a screenshot of it here. And so we plan to use the insights we gained from interviews to refine the interactive tool so that it provides information we heard individuals would like, and then also get feedback from them after we have a working enough prototype that the individuals can react to. So just a couple of thoughts to summarize up this project. This was actually the first time GEM collaborated with social scientists while engaging in a co-development process for Recover. So usually our co-development is very informal. We go to a lot of workshops, we interact, we have discussions with them a lot, but this was the first time that we were able to do formal interviews and analyze that data in a social science theory, which was pretty cool. And because Recover takes a system-wide perspective, but individual Recover members may also be interested in smaller spatial and temporal scales, there was a little bit of a conflict between what some individuals want for their specific agency goals versus the goals of Recover. And so this also made it a bit complicated to develop a tool that makes everybody happy. So we had to interpret the feedback of the interviews under the lens of objectives of Recover, which meant some feedback didn't make it into this project's tools. But their feedback will be incorporated into a separate tool that will hopefully give them the information they want for their individual agency decisions. And of course, the Everglades itself is very complicated, and so synthesizing information is challenging without any helpful tools. And so using both formal and informal co-development and feedback processes with the end users of these tools is extremely essential. And with that, I am willing to take questions, but I'd first like to just make sure I thank our social scientist collaborators at the University of Florida, Maisha Clark and Stephanie Castellano, and the GEM team at USGS, which is led by Stephanie Romaniak, and also the funding provided by the Southeastern Climate Adaptation Center at USGS. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Great. That's great. Thank you, Laura. That was a great presentation. Comprehensive, lots of details in there. So we'll pause now, let folks either go ahead and type your question into the Q&A box, and I can read it out to Laura. If you prefer, you could raise your hand. You can see that raise hand bar down there at the bottom. And we can call on you and unmute, allow yourself to unmute and ask your question. So opening it up to the crowd here. Anybody want to dive in? Well, I'll dive in while, since I can, and I'm unmuted. So Laura, and you may have mentioned this, but what is the CERP? Is there an end point on that, an end date? I know it's been around for a while, and it may, I'm sorry if you said that, but what's the end game on that
I
project?
did not say an end game. There is a plan. So the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is a full plan that does have an end. There's something called an integrated delivery schedule that they periodically update depending on, because I mean, there's been delays and getting funding for different projects. That lays out all the things that they are going to do. And so that integrated delivery schedule, you can look it up. The most recent one will tell you when projects are slated to go through and when they're currently planned to be complete.
Great, thanks. All right, other questions? Stefan, you want to unmute yourself and
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
yep, very good.
Great. I was going to type it in the chat, but I have a long-ish question. So, yeah, Laura, thanks for the presentation. That's fantastic. The question that I have is a little bit around the tools that you're using, but also just around trying to meet management needs. I work in the North Central region with the cask, and one of the things we've found is when you have lots of different management priorities, it's kind of difficult to create tools or meet those various priorities because of how specific they may want those tools catered to their management need. I'm just curious how you've navigated that, how you've been able to sort of create tools that are broadly applicable without being so watered down that they can't be used for specific management purposes.
Yeah, that's definitely an eternal struggle, I think. And there's definitely people that would prefer that some of our tools have a better spatial resolution and more detailed outputs. The thing that I always go to is like when I'm developing a tool, I'm looking at like what are the end user's main objectives, and so for this particular group, Recover, they are really looking at a system-wide perspective, and so being able to tell what's happening at your individual site that maybe you manage is maybe not as important as taking a system-wide perspective for a tool like this in Recover's perspective. But we do develop other tools for other purposes that are more targeted to some of those management decisions. And one example from our group is the Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow Viewer. It's focused on an endangered species. It's focused on the critical habitat of the endangered species and the water levels there. And so managers can go look at those water levels on the site and assess how the bird might be doing. And so that's an example of one where we're tailoring it to those very specific decisions. And then in this project that I talked about is looking at a system-wide perspective. And so some members of Recover have other things that they have to pay attention to and may want more information from this tool for Recover, but I focused on the goal of Recover itself instead of all of those individual agency goals.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I'm not seeing anybody else chime in here, so I might ask a follow-up question if that's okay.
Sure.
Just curious about the sort of process in developing tools, providing the information, going through the iteration with your management partners about what they need, and then getting to this place where like, okay, here's the information that you're asking for, but then them applying it to their specific question or use, and sort of if you're engaging in that part of the process as well, because I think that often it's a case of like just the handoff isn't sufficient. And so there often needs to be a little bit more, I'm reluctant to call it hand holding, but certainly like interpretation of the data, like appropriate use of the information. Just curious if you're a part of that process as well, and maybe some takeaways from doing that, because it's quite time intensive and energy intensive, and it can be quite unique depending on the person that you're working with. So just maybe kind of elaborate there.
Yeah, my philosophy is that if a user of my tool reaches out to me for help in identifying the assumptions with the tool, making sure they know the limitations, I am willing to talk them through that. I regularly present at different meetings in regards to that. I do work for USGS, so I can't tell them necessarily what conclusions they should draw from the tool. So I am limited in that, but I do try to help them through the thinking process and then ask them sort of what information they're looking for. And if it's a simple thing where, you know, they don't know how to extract some information that they need from the data format that we provide, that is something that I'm willing to do. I'm willing to just extract that for them and give it to them so that they can do their job.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Great co-production happening here. So a question has come into the chat. Could you clarify the relationship between the models presented here and the Everglades vulnerability analysis?
Okay, so the Everglades vulnerability analysis is it's an attempt to create a common framework of all of the models. So we have tons of little disparate models that are all modeling different parts of the Everglades, different species. And so what AVA, the Everglades vulnerability analysis, does is it takes those models and it puts them into a common Bayesian framework. And so it's not really developing new relationships or new insights on how the system impacts it, but it is bringing all of those and connecting them together. And so we have a couple modules on predicting vegetation succession. We have wading bird colony size. We have alligator nesting and sawgrass peat accretion. And we're working on a fish biomass module in it right now. And so we're trying to create this sort of system-wide model that has everything in sort of the same framework to try to make it a little bit easier for people to compare between those different indicators of ecosystem health on a landscape scale long-term trajectory.
Great, thanks. And Tina, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi. Well, first of all, Laura, this is your cousin, Tina. So
hello. Hi, Tina.
Yeah, I saw you posted this and I was like, oh, I have some time at work. I would definitely want to join in. And I just had a question. So from taking it from the perspective of a municipality here in South Florida, obviously one of our biggest concerns is when a hurricane comes through every year and it completely changes your landscape. So are your models flexible enough that you can incorporate like major scale changes like that may bring in a huge amount of unexpected fresh water into the system and then have to, reintegrate that into your models? How does that work?
So the models are built on historical data. So historical monitoring data. So it does incorporate data, monitoring data from when big storms have moved through. I think the challenge though is that the hydrologic modeling right now I don't think incorporates large storm events, and I need those hydrologic inputs to be able to predict what the wildlife and ecosystems are going to be doing. And so I know that that's something that we are working towards, but we're not quite there yet.
Well, very cool. Great job.
Great, thanks. Are there other questions from the folks on the call? I'll jump in with another then if possible, and then we'll move on to conclude. You mentioned that this is the first time that you've included social scientists on your research team, and curious to know if this experience has convinced you, for lack of a better terminology, to continue to do that as you go forward with other tools development.
Yeah, I think it was extremely helpful. In addition to like what it did for me was it took me out of the Everglades sort of bubble that I was in, and I had to explain to these social scientists what was going on and what was important and even help them interpret some of the things that some of our Recover members were saying to them, because they had no idea. I mean, the acronyms and the different connections between everything, it's a lot to learn. And even a new ecologist coming into the system has a lot to learn to be able to fully integrate that. And so that was a really eye-opening experience to me. And I think when I work with social scientists in the future, which I definitely think I will, I would want to give them more intensive lowdown on how the Everglades system works and how the different partners integrate with each other. I think that would make things a lot more successful, and I think that this was a success already.
Great, thanks. All right, time for maybe one more quick question, and then we'll start to move towards, we'll transition to completing. Well, first off, I wanted to say another opportunity to say thank you very much, Laura. This was a really great presentation. Thanks for some of these good questions as well. And I'm going to go ahead and share here so I can share out, hopefully successfully. There we go. So we wanted to wrap up today by letting you know about an upcoming event. And so this is our Southeast Cask Regional Science Symposium, which is coming up September 9th and 11th. It's going to be held in Asheville, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, and a little bit different landscape than the Everglades, but one that's experienced not sea level rise, but water of late. So hope you can join us. QR code there on your slide there, and which should lead you to our the website and ability to register. So also wanted to encourage you to subscribe to our monthly newsletter. It looks like some of you already have, or it was forwarded to you, such that you can learn about this seminar, other opportunities, funding calls. If you're going to be looking for a job, we post funding opportunities from partners there as well. So I will stop this share. So we are taking a break in July, but we'll be back in August. So and have a whole lineup of speakers for the fall. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of your day.